This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Watufani Poe, who teaches in the Department of Communication at Tulane University. Along with scholarly and public-facing pieces, he is completing a manuscript entitled Resisting Fragmentation, the Embodied Politics of Black Queer Worldmaking, an ethnohistoric study of Black LGBTQ+ social and political activism in Brazil and the United States that outlines how Black LGBTQ+ people push for freedom across various social and political movement spaces and imagine alternative worlds. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of language and transnational work in Black studies, the political impact of Black study, and the place of questions of gender and sexuality in the field. Watufani, good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
I'm really excited to have you on the podcast for a number of reasons. Really interested in hearing you talk about your research. More and more, I think getting people who work across the Americas on this podcast is extremely important, and you really add to that. And I'm really happy. I think the kind of work you're doing is so important to the field. So I was really happy about that. I will say, too, and I know that this is a value that my collaborator Ashley and I really have, you are Black studies from bachelor's through PhD. And I just think that perspective of people who have spent their young and to the present intellectual years in Black studies, I just think that perspective is so important to have as a part of the series. And so that's a long way of saying, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. And for all those reasons, really, really happy you made the time.
Oh, thank you. What a warm welcome. I'm really excited to have a conversation with folks who actually center Black studies as a kind of intellectual project, thinking about methodology, thinking about theoretical. Let's get into this conversation.
Absolutely. No, it's a distinctive thing. And those of us who, like me, who came through disciplines, we had to learn the tradition of Black studies. Ashley, my collaborator, that's her PhD and BA. And so she's like you, has from the beginning, a commitment to the distinctiveness. So, well, we'll have a chance to talk about your research, of course, and talk about, your vision of the field of Black studies and how these things work together. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question and just ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And always for me, that interesting part of, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work and what keeps you committed?
That's a great question. And I should say that the study of Black life, or kind of the political investment in Black life, is something that I think that I've carried with me from birth. So my parents, I was born to two Pan-Africanist organizers. My parents met doing Pan-Africanist organizing with the All-African Revolutionary People's Party in San Jose, California. They were students at San Jose State. And so that's the kind of political world that I came into. When I was 3 years old, my family moved from Riverside, California to Philadelphia so that my dad could pursue his PhD in African American Studies at Temple University.
Oh, wow.
So
I did not see this coming. Okay. I love that.
None of these things are new to me in that sense. I feel like the kind of reverence for Black studies as a field, African American studies, Africology, all of these terminologies to this broad field, that reverence came from a young age. Now, it's not necessarily something that, while I was raised in this kind of environment, it's not necessarily something that I saw for myself throughout all my life. Matter of fact, for lots of my life, I was like, all right, I need some distance from this. Sure. And I think when I got to college myself, when I started thinking through questions intellectually, I realized that a lot of that kind of core political upbringing really shaped how I was asking intellectual questions. So it wasn't just that I was thinking through questions relating to, how does this affect Black folks, but also thinking through the questions of how does it affect Black folks across borders? How does it affect Black folks diasporically? How does it affect Black folks across language? I remember one really poignant example. We were studying in my an undergraduate course in Black Studies and History, the kind of first part of African American people, the 1619 to 1865 portion. We were talking about Richard Allen and the founding of the AME Church in Philadelphia. And we were talking about how there's this moment when the AME Church decides whether they want to migrate to newly independent Haiti at the time, or whether they want to stay and lay claim to the AME Church in Philadelphia. And so the church kind of divides, where part of the church goes to Haiti and part of the church stays, or the majority of the church stays in Philadelphia. And I was just really interested in this kind of early moment of thinking through, the early moment of what I see as a kind of Pan-Africanist movement happening in the AME Church. And fast forward a semester, I study abroad in the Dominican Republic. And while I'm studying abroad in the Dominican Republic, we make a trip to Samana, the Samana Peninsula, and we talk with what used to be an AME church and a descendant of the folks who migrated to what was then Haiti, but is now the Dominican Republic. So this is the time when Haiti and the Dominican Republic were unified to stop European powers from invading the island. And about 20 years later, then Dominican Republic splits off from Haiti. But I think one of the things that showed me is that this really incredibly important moment, early moment of a kind of Pan-Africanist movement, the story's incomplete if we actually don't have a full understanding of what the diaspora looks like, if we don't have a full understanding of the different languages that Black folks speak. Because I would have never understood that these folks who were going to Haiti are actually in the Dominican Republic. That's a story that's also a part of the Dominican Republic. The Haitian Revolution is also a story that is a part of the Dominican Republic. So it's not just located in that one part of the island, but it's an entire island story. So it affects Latin American history as much as it affects Haitian history. And so all of these questions for me showed the importance of a kind of larger understanding, a greater understanding of the different languages that Black folks speak, a different understanding of the different realities in different countries that Black folks exist in. So that for me, I was like, okay, that means that I need to learn language. That means that I need to be invested in speaking the languages, and speaking the language, it also means learning the cultures. What's the kind of cultural connections and the languages that people speak? It's not just about learning Spanish, but for me, it was about learning Dominican Spanish. When I went to Brazil, it's not just about learning Portuguese. It was about learning Brazilian Portuguese and the different kind of regionalities of Brazilian Portuguese. All of those things are important if I'm aiming to be a scholar of the Black diaspora, if I'm aiming to talk to Black people. That's I think what's propelled me the most is that I, at the end of the day, as an ethnographer, I want to be able to talk to Black people. And so that really has to bring forth an investment in being able to speak the language that people speak. So that story went a lot of places, but I think that kind of interest in thinking through the diaspora in various different locations really brought me back to the work of this kind of foundational Pan-Africanist upbringing that brought me back to kind of thinking through Black studies as an interesting intellectual project for myself.
And I think this comes up in a number of episodes, and it comes up again. And I really love the way it's appeared in this conversation, which is, the significance of language and language study in Black studies, which I still think is not a given. right? And it is interesting that, the way you narrated that, right, going from a Pan-Africanist, upbringing, right, or community, intellectual world, imagination,
Yeah.
and how, I think it's a question like, is a in what ways do we in Black Studies link a Pan-African imagination with language acquisition?
Yeah.
Right. I don't know that that's always the case. And, there's lots of ways to think and talk about that. But in the end, as you said, I just want to talk to Black people and therefore Dominican Spanish, right? Regional Brazilian Portuguese. These things become so important, right? It's not just the grammar of the language, but also the vernacular of its place and its sounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that even in thinking about my own experience with Pan-Africanist movements, like I think that there's even a tendency for us to diminish what we think is the Pan-African world, partially because of the languages we don't speak. So the ways in which, the idea about the conversation about speaking language really is deeply connected in understanding what those Black experiences are. And so I think a common misconception about Latin America that folks have is that, only a very small portion of people identify as Black. But if you understand the kind of intricacies of language in Spanish and Portuguese, you'll understand the different ways that people are identifying and how that might be conversational with a kind of Blackness. Or, taking the Dominican Republic as an example, you'll be able to understand why such a large population of Black people are choosing not to identify with terminologies that are relating to Black. So why are people identifying as something like Indio Oscuro or Dark Indian as opposed to being identified as Black because Black is Haitian? And how that then touches on these very raw histories of the kind of separation between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, histories of massacres of in the Dominican Republic of Haitians. And so all of these things are deeply connected to language if we're going to be able to understand the specific kinds of Blacknesses, the specific kinds of Black experiences that happen in each of these places. So I don't consider myself as someone who's very good at language, but the suffering of those very beginner language courses, the kind of fruit of that experience came forth in being able to have these kinds of deep conversations about the why of the ways in which people identify. And I think that more of us actually have to be deeply invested in that project of language learning.
Yeah, those people who just pick up languages immediately. I have such envy and resentment. Those people, I was like, I
wish I was one of those.
A couple of friends like that, and they don't even work on these kinds of issues. I'm just like, give me your skill.
Yes.
Maybe I would take one of those Neuralink chips or whatever if I could get that kind of language. But, the way it opens the world, but I also think, just the way you're talking about it. And so I'm just always happy to hear people talk about on the podcast about the importance of language study. It's a deep thing, the abiding thing for me. But also, it's partly, what you said about, the way the language and its vernacular character open up whole worlds, and that if we want to understand diaspora, we have to understand the diversity of those worlds and how you get inside it through language. But also what you just said, which is I may not be very good at it, but I know it's important. And I think it's that moment of, it's not a thing that at least American academia really has as a value.
No.
And I think it's also true in Black studies that humility, it's, if not even humility, it's just a reality check of I have a very partial thing here.
Yeah.
But once you understand that finitude or that partiality, you can see what those other horizons look like.
Right. And I think it's something that we could actually take a page out of the book of our colleagues, our Black colleagues from the Global South. Because, if there's anything that folks from Brazil have taught me, is that language learning is primary to them. And that's partially because they have to, a lot of Brazilian academics are working also within the context of the Academy of the Global North. And so they understand that those academies are not going to speak their language, and so they have to speak their language. But I think also then what that brings forth is that they're able to communicate with different Black communities in different places. And so I actually think that we should definitely take a page out of their book, as messed up as that book might be. The reasons that they have to learn different languages are messed up, but I actually think that there's a lot that we can learn from that act.
I love that. Yeah, thank you. No, it's a nice embellishment of this whole part of this conversation. I love that. I mean, it's not like we have to reinvent or we have to invent this. It really is something that's practiced in our very midst.
Right.
Sometimes in our very best conference moments of someone from Brazil, Colombia, and in English, but also in other crossing languages. So let me ask a broader question about Black studies. I initially thought, well, this was going to sort of ask you back to your college days and your major. I hadn't realized that it would actually go down the paternal line of a PhD in Black studies. But, this extensive, engagement with Black studies, it makes for a really interesting, it makes you really a compelling person to ask this question to, which is, what is that portrait of Black studies for you? What is that? How does it function in your imagination? And I ask this always in the context of its founding, which had, the student demand for a place for the study of Black life, right? And that generated Black studies as a field that's committed to and has an imperative to sustaining, developing, and deepening our appreciation of the Black intellectual tradition. So that life of study. But of course, exactly at that moment in the late 1960s and early 1970s was the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, which had really worked to contest, if not outright eliminate, those boundaries between study and action, between ideas and political prescription,
Right.
between the classroom and community politics. And so there's also at the founding of Black Studies a political vision and a political commitment that says, Black Studies is about this particular kind of politics around Black liberation struggle.
Yeah.
And so I think that's still with us today, where it's like a tension between a commitment to intellectual life and a commitment to a certain kind of political prescription. And I always say tension rather than contradiction. I think but it pushes us in different directions.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in that context, what is your portrait of Black studies that you work with and that you have your, such deep commitments to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I really resonate with a lot of the kind of political history that you outlined of Black studies. For me, thinking about the history, so Black studies as a kind of intellectual project has lots of different strains. We could take it back to the work that Du Bois was developing throughout his intellectual career. We could take it back to Zora Neale Hurston trying to do a PhD in Negro studies at Columbia, even if she never finished that project. We could take it back to so many different kind of intellectual strains. But when you think about the field of Black studies that's kind of founding within the academy, I don't think there's any way of separating the field of Black studies to the struggle, the collective struggle of Black people. So the founding of the School of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State. And the kind of movement for Black studies at San Francisco State, that there's no way to separate that from a kind of larger political movement that doesn't just encompass the idea that we need to be able to study Black people, but the kind of connection to the idea that Black people deserve to be free. And so like its arrival in the academy draws on all of these kinds of intellectual strands, but its arrival at the academy is the result of Black social movement, and Black social movement in solidarity with other quote unquote third world peoples. And I think that that's really important for us to think about, particularly in this moment where there's a number of PhD programs in Black Studies it's a kind of hyper institutionalized moment, which is great because folks can get their PhDs in Africana Studies, and then departments in Black Studies can actually search for someone who has their PhD in Black Studies, and there's all kinds of benefits to that. But I think that I'm also thinking about what are the kinds of problematics of institutionalization and how we can at times forget that kind of that political investment in Black freedom and Black freedom across borders. That I think that the original project, the arrival of Black Studies as a field within the academy, that was deeply connected to that collective Black struggle. And so I think that's one of the things that I am concerned about in this moment of institutionalization of Black Studies. How do we not lose that investment in a kind of political struggle? How do we not sit in a place of relative safety? And I don't think that it's safe to be an academic speaking about certain political issues in this moment. But I do think that there's a way that I don't think any Black person is safe, really. And so what are the things that we're willing to risk in the position that we're in, understanding that we are a field that comes from social movement, that comes from Black social movement. Now, I also think about when I was thinking about graduate school, when I was thinking about what field that I wanted to go to, I think one of the reasons, both in graduate school and in undergrad, one of the reasons that I wanted to stick with Black Studies is not necessarily because I was a person who felt like, okay, this is a perfect field and this is a place where I can find an intellectual home in. I think for myself, thinking about coming into myself as a young Black queer activist when I was in undergrad, I think part of the reason that I wanted to stick with Black Studies is because I wanted to find place to expand Black Studies from within. When I was an undergrad, I didn't have any classes that were on Black queer studies. I read, we read the Combahee River Collective in Intro to Black Studies, but that was probably the extent of kind of Black queer studies content that I got when I was in undergrad. And it wasn't really until graduate school that I was able to read widely within Black queer studies. And so when I was in undergrad, I felt an overwhelming sense of, Black studies is really good at studying a Black cis heterosexual subject. And that's it. And so I was really, really I think I was really concerned with asking the field, is there space to expand beyond that kind of initial subject? And I think that what I learned throughout graduate school is that there's been a long movement of trying to expand Black studies. And I think that the field has expanded the kind of ways in which a kind of intersectional approach is seen as foundational in a lot of Black studies programs. I think that I'm happy to see that growth. And I also think that's not necessarily a given for all Black studies programs still. And I think that there's still a kind of push that needs to happen around thinking beyond a lowest common denominator subject. This idea that, the Black cis heterosexual man, because it's the kind of social location that we can all understand, that's the place that we should begin from. I think that there's still room for Black studies to agitate beyond that. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was invested in staying in Black studies. I felt like I was birthed into Black studies, but I think that I stayed because I was invested in in expanding the field. And now I think that I'm on the other side of graduate school. Now that I'm in the field, I think that I'm absolutely invested in fighting alongside lots of scholars who are doing that work of expanding the field.
Yeah, I mean, this is a theme that's come up of course, across the series, and I think there's a real there's lots of dynamics, some of which are just about the who's an academic, who's allowed to be an academic in the 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s, and also the way that combined with how do you found a field and establish a sense of uniformity, and that idea that a field or a quasi-discipline would have uniformity, right? Like English has its this and that makes it English, philosophy, etc. But not being a discipline and actually being concerned with Black life and its diversity, right, is a sort of push against, I think, the disciplinary habits that the academy has, that when combined with obvious like demographics and sort of social and moral values of founders and professors and institutions, it's a potent thing. But I like that you saw it. You said born into it, and it's like, well, when it's a family affair, sometimes you leave the family, but sometimes you try to reinvent the family, and so
yes.
Well, I'm glad you and lots of other people stayed, because this is, it's so important. And, this might actually be an answer to already a response to the question I had for you, which was to think about how you think about your own research in relation to Black studies. You work in activist politics. You said you're an ethnographer, cultural history, gender queer studies. Yeah. And so this combination, there's this so much potent insight that comes from that for the field of Black studies. So I'm interested in hearing you talk, as you just talked, about what boundaries it pushes in the field, what new horizons it opens up, but also where you see it fitting into the history of Black studies. When you said the collective statement is something that you read in intro, but that was the only, it's like, the way it was the only, that also is a cornerstone, but a little corner of the cornerstone. But how do you see your work as fitting into the history of Black studies, but also pushing new horizons? That's the question.
That's such a great question. I mean, so every semester now at Tulane, I teach a course called cross-cultural analysis. And the kind of central question in that course is, how do we do the kind of hands-on process of ethnography? And when I'm teaching that course, I like to begin watching the Tracy Heather Strain documentary on Zora Neale Hurston, because I think that Zora Neale Hurston is a really interesting character to think about how she's doing ethnography as this project to study Black folklore, the Black U.S. South, Black diaspora, but also to understand the ways in which Zora Neale Hurston, even in the moments of being an ethnographer, is always kind of traversing disciplinary boundaries. So, she comes through to literature through the process of ethnography, and, the kind of wanting to do this PhD in Negro studies at Columbia is an interdisciplinary project. And so I think that takes me to the ways in which historical figures within Black studies have historically seen the importance of interdisciplinarity in getting to the answers of the questions we have about the problems that Black people face. I think you can see that with Zora Neale Hurston. We can see that with W.E.B. Du Bois, the way that Du Bois finds the necessity to go beyond sociology to understand the problematic Black life in the U.S. That these disciplinary boundaries aren't enough to be able to answer the questions of the problems that plague our community. And I think that I really resonate with that in terms of the kind of work that I do. So I think that's really one of the things that's kept me with Black studies, this embrace of interdisciplinarity. Now I've been blessed to both have that emphasis on interdisciplinarity, while also getting a kind of concrete training in ethnographic method from my advisor in grad school, Kishkan Perry, and a kind of concrete methodological training in archival method from one of my committee members, and getting a master's in history on the way to the PhD. And I think that's also shown me both sides of the argument. What is the kind of benefit of actually being trained in a disciplinary method? And then what is the benefit of bringing a kind of interdisciplinary approach to it? And I think that when I think about how I teach research methods to my students, I want to teach them, here are the kind of concrete ways that you can do research methods. And also, here are the ways that one research method is not enough to be able to get to the answers that you're seeking. And I think that's a kind of lens, a particular kind of analysis that was brought forth through my training in Black Studies and Africana Studies. And so I think that's the kind of way. It's hard to place me disciplinarily. And yet, I also think that I converse with disciplines as well. I converse with history. I converse with anthropology. I converse with communication. I converse with sociology. And my work seeks to put all of those fields in conversation with one another, because the kinds of questions that I'm dealing with necessitate that we think beyond discipline. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an important, I think, feature, and a thing that I wish you could just sort of implant in people's understanding of the field of Black Studies who aren't in it, is just the immense amount of work one has to do to be good at the field, because you can't. It's not that being a doctor, getting a doctorate in a discipline is easy, but a doctorate in a discipline requires a very different thing than a multidisciplinary Black Studies approach to a problem, right?
Yeah.
As you said, having to figure out a way that sociological insights and research and methods might be helpful along with art history, with music, with literature. Right. It's an intense amount of work. And so I'm just happy to hear you sort of lay that out there like that. And, that's where, again, you being born into Black Studies turns out not only from undergraduate days, but before undergraduate days, has you already oriented that way. You've talked a lot about how it impacts how you construct and imagine and execute a research project. Yeah. But I'm also interested, like, in classrooms. How do you think that really not having spent any time in a discipline in terms of your education and, now in communication, Department of Communication, which I guess maybe is a discipline. I don't think so. But, you haven't spent time in a discipline. So I'm interested if you have a sense of how that commitment to Black Studies from the beginning has shaped just how you even understand what a classroom is, like setting it up, being there, putting a syllabus together, facilitating insight.
That's a great question. And I think I'll be honest, I think it's one I'm still figuring out. I think that I'm still in a kind of troubleshooting mode in my classrooms. I'm still figuring out how to teach the material that I'm teaching, especially because I was not trained in communication, but I am here in a communication department. And so figuring out how to be conversant with this field, I think, is important. But I also think that some of the tools that I think were helpful for me in my time in Black Studies were kind of those moments in a kind of interdisciplinarity, not necessarily being and ignoring to the specificity of how to play out method. So because I was doing an interdisciplinary approach didn't mean that I didn't need to know how to write an IRB proposal. Didn't mean that I didn't need to know how to conduct ethnography ethically. Didn't mean that I didn't need to know how to write field notes. Didn't mean that I didn't need to know how to conduct archival research. All of these things I needed to understand how to do before I could even get to that point of, well, let's dissect these methods. And so I think that for me, that takes me to when I'm doing a class like cross-cultural analysis, I pay really close attention about the kind of nitty-gritty of the method. So, how do you sit and observe something? How do you then write field notes about that observation? And then how do you take those field notes and then transform them into paper? And I give a lot of time for students to ask questions because I understand that that's not something that that they're used to doing. When I think about the majority of research papers that they are assigned to write, largely they're doing a kind of discourse analysis or literary analysis, or very basic kind of historical archival research, working with secondary sources mostly. So to shift them into doing something new, I understand that we have to spend a lot of time talking about the nitty-gritty, talking about what's hard, about what's confusing, and making space for students to open up around that in the classroom setting. I also, before they turn in their final papers every semester after they've done just an observation session, after they've done an interview session, I make space for all students in my class to come to office hours with me individually, so that we can talk through and troubleshoot any of the kind of things that they're struggling with now that we've learned the kind of nitty-gritty of ethnography. And so I think that all of those things, that kind of individualized support and an understanding of the importance of the kind of granular understanding of method, I think that came from that interdisciplinary training that I received in Black Studies. Interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So
Sure.
understand what these disciplines look like in a granular level before we get to the kind of bigger interdisciplinary approach. And so I think that those things have been helpful in terms of figuring out how to pass along kind of basic methodological training to my students in the classroom. But I think that I'm still figuring all of these things out. And to some extent, I hope that I am still figuring all these things out in 10 years. I'll have more tools too, but I hope to continue that kind of process of being a learner in the context of my classroom and continuing to transform the kinds of things that I'm doing with my students.
And I think the Black Studies classroom is really a classroom in motion.
Yes.
And if it is a classroom in motion, what would it mean to stop its motion? Would it mean to sort of betray its character? But if it's in motion, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. But that's part of the thrill. I think there's something very stressful about a Black Studies classroom.
Yeah.
Because you can't, you talk about the granular. I love that. But it's also like you don't know, or not that you don't know, but you can't assume that the students will frame the material in a particular way.
Yes.
I was in a very, very early, late 90s part of my career, which is strange how long ago that was. Let me just tell you, man, sometimes time just disappears. But I was in philosophy departments, and there was a way that you could shape and anticipate the way students would respond to material. But in a Black Studies classroom, it was my first lesson was, to find ways to improvise and give contour to a learning space in motion. I find it very beautiful. I love working with that, but it requires a real temperament, which I think you've outlined, because it doesn't mean there's not the granular or rigor. To quote, oh God, who was it? From very early, Courtney Terry, I think, very early podcast where she said, rigor is love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like love for the material is approaching it in a rigorous fashion, but sometimes rigor is also improvisation, and that's a beautiful thing too. So I like that, you hope you're there in 10 years. I hope so too. I think that's true to the essence of what we're doing. So
Yeah.
So let me ask you, as part of last two questions I have for you. This first one, I think you've already spoken to quite a bit, but I'll ask it again. When you look back at the history of Black studies, what do you think that it's done well? But also, what do you think it has not done particularly well?
That's a great question.
By the way, I want to have a whole separate podcast where I just splice together people's pause after this question. Everybody's like, let me think.
It's a hard question.
Yeah, it is.
It's a very hard question. I think that some of the best things that I think Black studies has done is the ways that it's allowed us to have um, an analysis of power that deeply takes seriously the question of what anti-Black racism looks like. So, I mean, even if we think about the ways in which Black studies has shifted and transformed Marxist analysis, I think that it's done really important work in terms of understanding what the transatlantic slave trade, how the transatlantic slave trade shifted the world, and how that shifted the ways in which power works and functions in the world. I think that that's one thing that Black studies has done really well. I also really think that Black studies has really contributed creative approaches to research. So I probably every semester I've included something from, in all my classes, included something from Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, largely because I think it's just really interesting to think about the ways in which she's merging archival research and a kind of literary narrative approach that I think brings forth a similar kind of creativity of someone like Zora Neale Hurston writing Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I think that like that kind of the beautiful narrative writing of something like Black Reconstruction or something like Souls of Black Folk, I think that there's a really, really beautiful creativity that Black studies has brought to the study of things that are incredibly difficult, incredibly heavy. So those are two examples of things that I think Black studies has done well. I think that something that Black studies could perhaps work on are the ways in which we converse with theoretical movements, fields that we don't agree with, or that we have critiques of. I think the most glaring example in my mind are the ways in which I have seen certain folks in Black studies, Africana studies be dismissive of certain fields like Afro-pessimism, for example. I don't define my work as Afro-pessimist, but I have been blown away by the amount of people who haven't read anything from Afro-pessimism and are ready to tear it apart. And I think that actually reading Afro-pessimist work, attempting to understand it in a way that is kind of that attempts to understand it on the terms that it's outlining. I think that has actually made my work better in the ways in which I'm trying to approach social movement studies, the ways that I'm trying to understand Black, queer, and trans social movements. And I think that it has also taken out of my mind critiques of Afrofeminism that were drilled into my mind by folks who haven't read the works. So I think that you could say that of lots of different fields. You could say that about the ways in which people critique Black queer studies, Black feminism. I think that there's a way in which there's times in which we can talk at one another without actually talking to one another or reading one another. I think that we could do better as a field with that.
It raises an interesting question about, the origin of Black studies, commitment to a sense of community. And we scholars are also a community. I think that's easy to forget because we work in such a sort of rancher libertarian mindset of whether it's careerist or just on our own research projects or, our own sort of micro communities. But I think affirming that sense of scholarly community and what that would mean for ethically reading and generously reading and also rigorous debate.
Yes.
Debate makes things go around, but
critique something, but read it first. Read it with care first.
The way reading has, I just think, fallen off the last 10 years. It's really too bad because there's so many fantastic books.
Yes. Yeah.
I still like reading. I would love to just take a year and go read on a hilltop
just read,
or a beach or a swamp or something. So
we need those kinds of fellowships.
Yes, exactly. Just read, don't write. So let me ask a last question then. In the Black Studies context, what's the issue you would want us to all be thinking about or the question you would want us to all be asking?
I think the question I think the kind of existential question that haunts me in this moment as a Black Studies scholar is, how do we collectively survive? And yes, I think that I'm thinking about that. How do we collectively as Black people survive? But understanding that the question of how do we collectively survive, that's for humanity to collectively survive, Black people need to collectively survive. And I think that I am, I think that I was talking about this, the ways in which we don't talk to one another in the last question. And I actually think the kinds of development of a kind of speculative visions of tomorrow can be bettered by talking with folks that we don't actually agree with. So I'm thinking about what would it be if we got some Afro-pessimists and Afro-futurists in the room to talk about how do we move beyond where we are? How do we move beyond this world in a kind of metaphorical sense? I don't know if the solution is a spaceship is coming to take us somewhere else. Especially because if a spaceship came and took us somewhere else, we'd still be living in anti-Black worlds. But I think that I'm really, really concerned with how my students come to class incredibly depressed often. Because of the ways in which the world is currently. And, it's complicated because I'm also depressed with them, feeling this kind of existential anxiety. But I'm also how can we as a field help us to build tools that are not just relevant in the study of Black people, but are relevant in building different worlds, that are relevant in building different futures. And I think that, what's in the archive is helpful. The kind of discourse analysis that we offer from creative world is helpful. But I think regardless, I think that needs to be on the minds of everyone. I mean, yeah, I'm putting together this special issue with two colleagues on kind of investing in Black, queer, and trans futures. And we started this back when I was a postdoc at Amherst in 2021. And just to think about how difficult it is to approach those questions now versus back in 2021, how much more complex the question has gotten. I mean, I think that it's really, really urgent for us to think about the ways in which, like the kind of specific ways that we can create a different tomorrow, a tomorrow that doesn't represent the kind of genocidal realities that we're facing in the now. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe that's my own existential anxiety, but I think that that's the thing. When I sit down and read New Black Studies works today, when I sit down and read for class, I think that that's always at the front of my mind, because my students will come at me with very difficult questions that are about this kind of question of, how are we going to make a different tomorrow? Or how are we going to survive collectively? And I'm trying to be prepared for those questions in terms of helping them to think through these questions, helping us to think through these questions collectively. So I think that that's at the center of my mind when I think about the future of what questions should be coming out of our field.
I love that. That's a wonderful place to end, and that work of imagination in the time of despair is so important. But I would venture the speculative claim that if you want to talk about the Atlantic world, that's been one of the signature features of the Black tradition.
Yes,
there's a capacity to imagine a different kind of world in time of deepest crisis. So I love the way you've come to that after this, journey through all kinds of aspects of thinking about classrooms, research projects, voices in the field, futures and pasts of the field. And this has just been a fantastic conversation. It's given me a lot to think about, learned a lot. That'll be true for all of the listeners. This is a great contribution to the series. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on. This was such a joy.
Yeah, total joy for me too. So, well, have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.